So against the color line, segregation and Pan-Africanism in the 20th century. Since the turn of the 20th century, white people in the United States had passed laws that restricted Black people to inferior Jim Crow conditions in schools, railway station platforms, neighborhoods, restaurants, theaters, waiting rooms, amusement parks, public water fountains, and train cars. Color bars imposed by white employers and workers prevented Black people from prestigious and higher paying jobs. Voting restrictions reinforced and cemented these discriminatory and grim treatment of the United States Black citizens. Residential segregation and its accompanying discriminations were spreading the world in that very century. As Reverend Dr. Ernest Leon said to his overflowing congregation of African Americans at the John Wesley Methodist Episcopal Church in Baltimore, Maryland, on December 4, 1910, segregation was apparent everywhere. To quote Nightingale, white people almost everywhere had decided it was worth the effort to put into place color lines in not only the United States, but even in Africa, the natural habitat of the black man, quotes and unquote. Having returned from Liberia, West Africa, he was the United States resident minister and consul general. Reverend Leon reported that in the neighboring city of Freetown, which was then the British capital city of the colony of Sierra Leone, for example, white people were living in a hill station, which was an exclusive European residential zone on a highland that was few miles from the city's Black neighborhood in the downtown district. Early in the 19th century, the British had built the downtown neighborhood for freed enslaved Africans. It was in the cities, especially the capital cities run by the British, the French, Germans, Belgians, and Portuguese, that the rearrangements of cityscapes and people along racial lines was most visible. For my larger book project, I covered 3 organized and powerful groups of people responsible for spreading residential segregation in Africa that the Reverend talked about on his December 4 preaching. The institutions included intellectual organizations, governments, and real estate capitalists. While demonstrating the interconnection of segregation, it shows the ways urban residents challenged and subverted segregationist plans. This is not to say that segregation did not work nor adversely impacted African urban residents. It did have a far-reaching and terrible consequences, the legacy of which is still felt today. What I am saying is that it did not go uncontested in explicit and covert ways that yielded unexpected results. To be more specific, the book project explores British colonial capitals in the so-called Gold Coast and Kenya in the 20th century, when residential segregation was at its peak. So these are the cities that were way apart, but they were different in terms of the ways in which they grew. So the Gold Coast, which is present-day Ghana, has its capital right on the Atlantic Ocean, whereas Kenya had its inland. So that sort of like impacted the dynamics of segregation in these two cities. Urban segregation was designed to facilitate the control of British and Boer transients and settlers, but the privileges that came with it extended to white people in general. For example, for the ordinary man in Accra, the Lebanese or the Syrian was not so different from the British or the Portuguese. In the interest of time, I like to focus on the British government and intellectuals, two of the powerful segregationists that I mentioned earlier. Governments had the means to transport intellectuals to different parts of the world. Intellectuals provided the scientific basis for segregationist policies and practices. In this case, their theories pathologized Black bodies and advocated a separation of white people. Take William John Simpson, for example. This picture, basically, I couldn't find a picture of himself, but then this is the London School of Tropical Medicine. And then in the second row, he is the third person with a slight tilt, and then just hands on his lap. But take him, for example, he was one of the British government's foremost segregationists and public health experts. He was a professor in the London School of Tropical Medicine. Simpson was sent to the Gold Coast, Ghana, and Kenya to provide the blueprints for urban design and governance to prevent future outbreaks of the plague. At the time he arrived in Accra, the capital of the Gold Coast, in early 1908, the plague was already raging. His immediate job was to assist the colonial administration to avert the spread of the disease. Among a flurry of mitigation measures, Simpson proposed a creation of a buffer zone between the African neighborhoods and European residential enclave, as well as praised the colonial government's effort at residential segregation, which was already in vogue for over a decade. Here is a map of Accra, which is right along the Atlantic Ocean. And if you look to the west, is the African neighborhood. And to the extreme east is another African neighborhood. In the middle of Accra was the European segregated quarter that basically was spreading along the Atlantic Ocean. So basically, the policy of the British government was to remove these African neighborhoods in order to allow for more Europeans to build their houses. But there was a lot of opposition that the colonial administration felt that it was becoming unstable to govern. So they had to stop the horizontal spread of the European neighborhood and rather to make it go northeast. Racial segregation, because it privileged the white minority and underprivileged the tax-paying African majority, it was one of the most resented features of the colonial regime. While there was a serious rift between the medical community and the civil administration in Accra over Simpson's blueprint, the House of Commons in Britain and the Colonial Office in London praised the amazing work Simpson had done in Accra. Based on that, they recommended him for another job in Nairobi, Kenya, to tackle a serious plague outbreak in 1913. Simpson proposed his signature solution to public health emergency, residential segregation along racial lines. That is a map of Nairobi. And basically the way it developed in a circular way. And then Europeans actually lived on the hill, which was a slight elevation to the west and then south of the city. Now the place, where the broken line is basically an Indian market, but also a residential area where Simpson had proposed that it should be removed so that that whole space can be homogenized to make it Europeans. So Europeans will be living in the white area and in the hills, and then they'll have a commercial area that serves as a buffer to the rest of the city. So to the east and then to the southeast would be Indian and then African neighborhoods. But one of the big buffers between these two residential areas, the green spaces that you see in the north and then in the south, were supposed to be the buffer zones that would protect European residential areas from Africans and then Indians. So this was some sort of a plan that was layered on the existing plan of Nairobi. I'm going to go ahead and then talk about some of the movements against these segregationist plans. The most radical forms of divided cities along racial lines appeared in South Africa and American cities during this period. Baltimore, Chicago, Durban, Johannesburg, and Cape Town are examples. Civil rights movements in the United States were part of a loose alliance of global coalitions that ended the colonial regimes in Africa and formally ended residential segregation. Thus, movements against racial injustice, and for racial equity can be placed within a broader world history of decolonization and Pan-Africanism. One has to pay attention to both local and global activism that forged a conception of Black identity. To strategize on how to fight colonial regime and its racist policies and practices, the Fifth Pan-African Congress, held in October 1945 in Manchester, Britain, brought together African American civil rights movements and future leaders of African liberation, like Kwame Nkrumah and Jomo Kenyatta. Kwame Nkrumah was the first nationalist leader of Ghana. He is to your right, and Jomo Kenyatta was the first nationalist leader in Kenya, and he is to your left. Kwame Nkrumah himself had been studying in the United States and Britain for a decade. Kenyatta was also studying in Britain. Both independent African leaders experienced racial injustice firsthand, not only outside, but after they returned to their respective homelands to come and then experience colonialism. While abroad, they built a network of Black activists fighting for racial equity. Nkrumah and Kenyatta were able to rally the masses against colonial discrimination and brought about independence in Africa. The wind of change that blew through Africa in the 1950s and 1960s and brought about independence is the result of a broader coalition of Black people across national boundaries. Take W.E.B. Du Bois, for example. He spent most of his life in the struggle for Black freedom. Through Pan-Africanism, he worked closely with Kwame Nkrumah, the leader of African liberation, the leader of Ghanaian liberation and also African liberation, and spent his last years in Ghana. He indeed became a citizen of Ghana. The fruit of his work is the Africana Encyclopedia, which he did not live to complete. Urban segregation, which enhanced the control of white people and subjected the other to grim discriminatory conditions, was global and reached its high watermark in the 20th century. So too did the movement against it, which saw alliances that transcended national boundaries. We witnessed a glimpse of the somber impact of segregationist policies and practices in summer 2020, when police officer Derek Chauvin killed George Floyd by pressing his knee on his neck against the floor. Also, we saw in full display the global response to that extreme cruelty displayed by the officer. What made him think that he could do that to a Black man? The answer lies in the shared history of enslavement of Black people, segregation, racism, and systemic inequality, not only in the United States and beyond, but in the ways in which international relations are conducted on the global scale. Which is why efforts against it should transcend national boundaries, like how Pan-Africanists in the Congress, in the Pan-Africanist Congress in Manchester in 1945 envisioned, like how W.E.B. Du Bois and Kwame Nkrumah also thought about. As a historian of 20th century divided cities, I have come to see urban planning as one of the many ways through which the privileged few enacted segregationists and discriminatory policies against majority urban residents. More than half of the world's population now live in cities. Cities, by their nature, are supposed to be diverse because of the varying and rich opportunities they provide in economics, politics, and culture. But discriminatory policies and practices that try to homogenize space, like gentrification, for example, diminish the opportunity. With that in mind, I explore this overarching question. Since we need our cities more than ever, how do we make them more equitable? An answer is encouraging people of color to enter into urban planning and development, so they are also at the drawing board where neighborhoods are planned, so they can have a voice in the ways in which their neighborhoods are planned, so they can decide the positions of where some amenities and infrastructure can be at. As I am going to demonstrate in my upcoming book, planning was dominated by privileged white people. They looked out for their own in the 20th century. The situation has not changed that much. Allow me to conclude this talk by showing you a video of some of the works that we have done to encourage planning among people of color, so they can get interested in the ways in which their neighborhoods are planned.
The project or whatever project we have in mind, it has taught me how to problem solve. It makes me think differently and try to use as many materials as I can.
We live in a world that, in part, has been designed and built by architects. The The idea that we started the Alberti program with was a simple one, and it was simply to introduce the students to the field of environmental design, excite them about the possibilities of what they might want to do in their future careers, but also to help them to see their own neighborhoods and communities and the world that they live in a little bit different way. The partnership with the Divided City Initiative has brought a new dimension. We're able to focus on the humanities and the history of our own city in a way that we hadn't before.
Providing people options to understand and communicate only helps move the world forward and then includes more people. Even if they are not going to be architects or designers, we learned another way of communicating ideas.
It makes me more creative, but it pushes me to be more determined and committed. We get to interact with kids and make new friends that we might not know because they go to different schools or they might live in different areas of St. Louis.
It also sort of like helps the transfer of ideas between different age groups who probably come from different income families. Students appreciate each other and where they're coming from. In Alberti, I get to contribute to the building of curriculum, and this role comes out from the Divided City Initiative. What are the social and economic processes that produce places? How the environment around them came into being.
The humanities in the Divided City have really been an enriching component to the curriculum. We ask the students to look at their neighborhood and begin to see it perhaps differently, but also as something that they can have influence on. Not only could they impact their environment, but their participation in making the community that they live in is extremely important and also rewarding.
When I grew up, I want to be an architect and engineer. Keep on building and designing the models that I have in my head.
Architects dream about building buildings and building a program that has the potential to introduce a young person to the field that I'm so passionate about is something that I could have never hoped for. It's been supported by countless numbers of people and faculty and parents and supporters over the last 10 years. And my hope is that if we come back here in 10 years on a Saturday morning with the kids in the Alberti program.
When I look at the buildings, I just think, oh, it's made out of bricks, but now I understand fully that there has to be a foundation. Building a project or whatever project we have in mind, it has taught me.
All right. With that, I end my talk. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Waseem, for that. That was wonderful. So at this point, I just want to open it up for conversation. I think this is probably, aside from just hearing from scholars, the opportunity to talk and to process and to think through how our own work kind of intersects with the work that you're presenting, your scholarship that you're bringing and sharing with us is, I think, one of the best parts about this time. So I invite anyone who has any questions or thoughts, if you have any comments, if you would like to just take that opportunity to ask, and we can engage in this dialogue. And if you feel more comfortable putting it in chat, I'll monitor the chat as well.
Hey, this is Stephanie Baker. I'm calling from my car, so I don't have my video on. But thank you so much, Waseem. I hope you realize what a gift you are to Elon University. That work is so interesting and relevant and current and historic and all the things at the same time. And so I was, I'm, me in public health. I was hoping maybe you could talk a little bit more about some of the health outcomes that you've looked at that have been impacted by your analysis that you shared, both in the countries in Africa as well as the work that you've done in the United States.
All right. In terms of the health impact on Africa, So basically, I think when you look at it historically, it always has been the provision of infrastructure that would help to prevent diseases. Um, Now, all of this were concentrated in European neighborhoods, whereas these things were lacking in African neighborhoods. So basically, by segregating these neighborhoods, it provided the municipality and the government the chance to be able to provide separate development. So this gave them the chance to concentrate um, infrastructure in these privileged neighborhoods. Now, Africans in the cities were able to access the hospitals. The problem with that is that um, these hospitals rather took away the limited wages that they made in the cities. So these hospitals and clinics that were built that Africans could benefit from um, only augmented the resources of the colonial government, only gave them the chance to make more money from Africans, rather than providing them the infrastructure like drains, municipal services, pipe-borne water that could help to prevent common diseases like cholera and malaria, which often is the cause of stagnant water where mosquitoes are able to breed. Uh, in terms of the US, I haven't done much work on the US, but one of the disease that we have talked about, especially in the St. Louis area, historically has been tuberculosis. In areas where African Americans have been forced to live in close quarters, where it was easy to pass the disease. So one of my friends was looking at plans where it was so easy to just map areas in St. Louis that you could clearly identify or where cases of cholera could clearly be identified and have actually been mapped.
Thank you.
Thank you, Wasim. This is Musa from the Department of Sociology and Anthropology. And thank you so much for the insightful and important research presentation that you've done. And I learned so much from you, especially on the intersection between residential segregation, public health, racism, and the common struggle that Black people and African people had to encounter, whether you are in Accra or whether you are in Nairobi, East or West Africa. The framing of sanitation, the framing of public health, and how that was used in including like infrastructural discrimination, educational discrimination, access to healthcare discrimination. Because in my own research also on Asmara, I found out that residential segregation was also used in basically dividing access to resources in Eritrea between Europeans, indigenous people as well. So if you can elaborate a little bit about the video that you showed us on the reimagination of the solutions or the perspectives that Black people, indigenous people, or even intellectuals are also building into the future of, how the future is reimagined in the context of Accra and Nairobi. Thank you very much.
Yes, in the context of the US, the Alberti program came up as a result of the divided city initiative that we were sort of like undertaking. And the idea was to encourage more African Americans to become urban planners. Um, One reason why we thought about the idea was that it isn't everybody in the community that wanted to be in politics. Um, People were better at communicating their ideas by just drawing or building models. Um, but also more importantly is the fact that as my research has shown, planning and development has always been limited to a few privileged white people. And whenever they planned urban spaces, um, they only looked out for people who were white and sort of were a bit haphazard about the ways in which they dealt with minority neighborhoods. So first of all, we thought that we should get African Americans to get interested in the profession, to be able to participate when their neighborhoods are being planned on the drawing board. And more importantly, the city as a theater of social action, of social interaction. Um, When left to just minority white people, they plan and then replan it in a way that tends to exclude people. So how do we get people of minority communities, communities to be part of this planning process? That's how the Alberti program came about. In terms of my work in Accra and then Nairobi, I think that the resources that are required to train planners um, and then designers is lacking. Especially when I was working with uh, my 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 partners in University of Nairobi, um, the geography and planning department, for example, didn't have the facility that we find in the US today. So there is still that lack in Africa. And then people who are also interested in planning do not usually get scholarship the way that people in the humanities do to come and study in places like the United States and then Africa. Sorry, the United States and then and Britain. Um, there is this international urban planner who actually designed the African American Museum, David Ajay, a Ghanaian but raised in Tanzania, who is also doing a lot of this work, trying to get Africans to get involved in planning and actually picking people and then training them. I think he was knighted recently by because of his work by the Queen.
I have a question here from Ryan Johnson in philosophy. And the question is about transportation in your research, thinking kind of in a framework of American versus African cities. And so he writes, he's thinking about the rise of car culture and the location of roads, highways, the loss of public transportation, white flight suburbs, et cetera. So if you would be willing to kind of talk through the idea of how transportation maybe is coming up in your research in these in the context of car culture, where roads and highways are located, and that loss of public transportation as well as flight.
In the case of Accra, the evidence that I have seen is that there was this deliberate attempt by the colonial government to plan roads and highways in a way that when they are approaching richer neighborhoods, they do not in any way approach poorer neighborhoods and the slums that were actually brought about by colonialism. One of the unintended consequences of creating a city is the emergence of slums and then highly because These people are often brought in to come and then do the work to build the cities, but they are always abandoned and disenfranchised at the same time after these cities are built. So, but the evidence that I see is that the colonial government were like, we can't let these people go because we need them, but then we have to plan the roads in a way that they do not approach these neighborhoods at all. It was the same thing that was done for Nairobi too, in the sense that most of the African neighborhoods were sort of like all moved to the southeastern corner where they were close to the industries. Most of the Europeans who were living in the highland areas didn't even know what was going on in the cities and then in the African neighborhoods, in the sense that none of their roads were made to approach these areas. So you needed to cross the river Nairobi in order to be able to get to some part of the town and then to the commercial center before you are able to get to, but then as golf courses and then trees and then mangroves were planted all over to also prevent the movement, to serve as a barrier for people to move to the richer neighborhoods. I think the long and short answer to your question is that there was this deliberate plan to build roads and highways that did not approach poorer neighborhoods at all.
Buffy, I saw there was a note in the chat before I jumped in. Can I just go ahead?
Go right ahead.
Okay, thank you. My work is in South Africa, and I'm curious about in your manuscript, do you tease out some of the complexities of race? Because I'm very interested in your framing of this question in terms of Black and white, but in a place like South Africa with some very complex racial dynamics, I'm wondering if you talk a little bit more, for example, about class and about contested land space.
Yes, another dimension of my argument has to do with class, in the ways in which some rich Africans were beginning to appropriate European lifestyles and try to distance themselves from poorer Africans. So I talk about that, but in some ways barriers were often put in place against them by Europeans at this point. The reason why I keep moving between the idea of white and then Europeans is that in Nairobi, which was also a settler colony, Nairobi settlers were continually following the example of South Africa. The municipality, the settler community actually wanted independence from the British government in order to be able to sort of like pursue policies that were done in South Africa. But the British government didn't give them that free hand. So in the evidence that I use, the concept of white and black, the concepts of white and black become really very common. It is different in Accra though, which was not a settler colony with small European population. They were mostly transients and were often sort of like not permanent at all. They were just moving back and forth. However, race was a bit complicated in that place too, not only because of the Europeans, but also we had Lebanese and Syrian workers who also lived under such privileged conditions. So for the ordinary African, there was no difference between the Lebanese and the Syrian, who lived like a rich person, lived in a segregated neighborhood and had swimming pools and tennis courts in where they lived. So the idea of class it's also, I talk about the idea of class, but I also demonstrate the ways in which race was articulated in the period, and sort of show the difference between South Africa, Nairobi, and then Accra.
Just a quick follow-up. In a contemporary sense, I'm really curious about the incursion, and I call it an incursion of the Chinese into the continent, especially in Kenya, with the funding of ports and other infrastructure as well, and how that might impact or evolve the argument that you're making in your manuscript.
Now, a lot of people are very upset with the government for encouraging the Chinese in, especially the environmental degradation that is going on there, but also just because of the explicit racist attitude of the Chinese in these countries. People are also very angry because they flout all the laws under the laws of Ghana. They are not supposed to do retail business, but that's exactly what they do. So now, but the government is taking a lot of bribes from the Chinese government, and also both in Kenya and then Ghana. So that is making it very hard. And I have argued that it's just a matter of time, in the sense that, and I always go back to the power, the idea of power in the people. Just the same way that colonialism ended abruptly, that nobody could see it coming. It got to a time when people were just frustrated. They got on the streets, they marched, and then eventually it caused a huge international crisis that the British had to move out of Nairobi and out of shame, and Nairobi and then Accra out of shame. I think that we are going to get to that point when the Chinese government will have no choice but to stop some of what it is doing. Because I think what's going on, they virtually own some of the infrastructure projects and some of the infrastructure that is built in both Ghana and then Kenya.
We had a few more notes in the chat. The last one that came in, I'm not just wanted to make sure people were aware of it. It has a link to the latest blog that you published, I believe, in September, that was looking at the link between discrimination and sanitation in Africa as well as in the US. So I wanted to make sure that people were aware of that link in the blog, that link in the chat that Charles just posted.
Thank you.
So I'm going to jump in.
Oh, okay.
Oh, no, someone else jump in. I heard, I saw silence, and so I was going to fill it. Go for it.
I'm filling it with words. I just wondered, especially given the Divided City Alberti project, which is really great and has me thinking in a bunch of different directions. And I know that you've been working in Burlington on a number of different things and thinking about the Elon community. If you had any sort of idea of maybe a wish list, or what you kind of conversation you'd like to see either happening about planning here on our campus, or planning, urban planning more in Burlington, Elon. I know that's a weird question, but.
I taught this class called Slums and Skyscrapers in the winter term. And some of my students, after the class, came up to me and told me that I got them thinking a lot about how Elon looked like before it was built, and how it expanded. Basically, all the social activities behind the infrastructure that we see. But one of the questions that I posed to my class was, how do we get Elon students interested in cities and planning and development? So there are many ways that I have thought about this. And right now I'm trying to see if I can collaborate with planners and architectural companies in Durham. I've seen a few of them in Durham and then in Raleigh, to see if we can get a few interested students to speak to them, sort of like have a sense of how cities are planned, the processes that go on. But another way to do this is to see the kind of conversations that go on in town councils, in municipal councils about how spaces are appropriated for different purposes, how they are purposed and repurposed over time, and what are the pros and the cons of that. So that's another way that I have thought about it. So basically to think about urban planning and place making as a social activity to get students to begin to think about how those have produced inequalities or how that can help produce equity in the society. So it's something I'm still writing and trying to clearly conceive, but I've been in touch with a number of planners and architects about that.
Waseem, as a quick follow-up to that, because I really appreciated the way that Evan made you recounted that conversation with your students, and you said, what about what Elon was like before? Well, that made me, I mean, I think about that more than I ever have thought about that, this whole history and memory thing. And students can't like figure out which, and I can't either, which lines of planning to track. Is it kind of the institutional planning through church history? Is it the fact that the land comes from the Trollinger family and the Trollinger family was a big slaveholding family and we can track all that? I mean, we've never written all that down. Or is it the fact that most of the land was occupied by Black residents and were displaced? Some, we haven't found a great paper trail, but I received last 2 weeks ago an email from a man who said, my family tradition is that Elon took my land. And we can't find a paper trail for it. But so everything that you're saying is making me think that some of the stuff that you're doing could resonate with this history and memory work as we try to understand it. And of course, the question that Ryan asked about railroads earlier connects here too. My tentative understanding is that a lot of Black men in the county worked on the railroad. I mean, that's not, we know that's true. And that one of the reasons why they put Elon here is that they knew there'd be a ready supply of labor. Some schools have a great sense of who did that early labor. We don't, but we feel like it's probably Black men who are probably not credited, and it's probably Black property on which it was built. So we're learning a lot about that. I'm wondering what you can say about those intersections.
I don't know much about the Elon case. I want to learn more about it. But in my study of Accra, for example, which was already built before European colonization, a lot of African neighborhoods were just demolished in order to even build things like golf courses for Europeans, for example. And recently, there is this conversation about planning Accra and building the coastline in a way that it faces the ocean. This is definitely something that is for tourist attraction, but also building a city that faces the west rather than back inward. And some of us have raised criticism. I have also been talking a lot that Accra is already congested. People are talking about sanitation issues because of the congestion. Where are you going to get the labor from? For sure, history shows that the natives of Accra will not do the work. They demean manual labor. So you are going to bring the labor from somewhere. how are you going to accommodate them? So the argument I am making is that you are bringing them in, you are going to encourage them to build their own close quarters neighborhoods. And then after the project is done, you are going to leave them. And that exacerbates the problem that is already there. So I think that this idea of developing places and then repurposing places that belong to indigenous people and also bringing different people in exacerbates the problems that we already have in these cities than help them. But then it's also a way of homogenizing space for the benefit of capitalists and rich people at the expense of poorer people.
I was writing in the chat, Elon, homogenizing space for the benefit of white people.
I'm gonna jump in, and it's the question, I think, is building off of the video that you showed, particularly the work, again, with young people. And I'm putting my developmental psychologist hat on, and thinking about the ways in which we need to revisit, maybe not revisit is not the word, but critically think about how we have socialized the concept of space and who owns space and who can manipulate space across generations. And I've been thinking about this a lot, particularly in a pandemic when you were forced to really reside in this, the space that you've either been allotted via mortgage or via rent, and make do with that space and try to think of ways to create more space, or looking at where you are in terms of the neighborhood. In a pandemic where we have multiple grocery stores to choose from, as well as Instacart if we don't want to go, in comparison to the person who's still riding the bus to get to a grocery store because where in their community they don't have all the options that they need. It really makes you think about space, and it's really made me think about the ways in which I simply walk through life kind of making do with the space that I'm given, as opposed to thinking about how I can recreate, repurpose, reclaim space. And it's made me think about the ways in which I'm socializing that intentionally or maybe unintentionally with my sons, going back even to think about George Floyd and the idea of, I do think that I socialize my sons to be mindful of the space that they are occupying because I'm worried about their safety. And so there's this whole underlying, I think, conversation that maybe is coming out in your work as well, in terms of thinking about this legacy of how you've been able to conceive of and even consider ownership of, or the permanence of holding on to space, and how that idea of that socialization of that has been transmitted over generations, and what do we need to do to change that?
It sort of reminds me of my own experience in Accra. I come from the northern part of Ghana. So I came to Accra, speaking of cities as places that provide opportunities. I came to Accra because I wanted to have a university education. But somebody from the north who comes to Accra, I don't have enough money. The city is expensive to live in a good place. So I had to live in a slum neighborhood. And every day I had to take a bus to the University of Ghana in order to attend classes. Now the journey between my neighborhood to the University of Ghana it's another story, in the sense that it took me around through rich neighborhoods before I got to the, so the everyday experience from this slum neighborhood to really wealthy neighborhoods, that was, by the way, European segregated neighborhoods, which has been appropriated, and now the richer African classes live there. That takes me there. It's something that made me think about space, the city. This is a time that I was writing about Islam, but I thought that I should have written about the city and space, how segregated that was. But it also made me think about the behind richer houses that the buses were not allowed to pass, because the city knew that the buses that were passing through these places were from poorer neighborhoods. So the route was designed in a way that the buses couldn't get through some neighborhoods, like go through the Chinese embassy, like go through the American embassy, but it had to go through certain, go behind certain houses in order to get me to the University of Ghana. So that made me aware of space and where I could see as somebody from an underprivileged section of the city. But when I went to school in the University of Ghana, these were the same people from these neighborhoods were the same people that I sat in the same class with to study. They were the people that I competed with, people that went to the best schools in the country that I competed with. So, so yes, that sort of like your comment reminds me of just how I came to think about space and the divided nature of it.
Yeah, just a follow-up, question or a comment, especially, you research on colonialism and, its implication in the post-colonial context, and the importance of critical thinking, and also the importance of decolonization. And I could see, how your work is so, timely and important when we are thinking about, in the contemporary times, about infrastructure investment that happens, for example, as a result of external funding that comes from China, for example. How are those, infrastructures or investments in railroads, for example, how are they being built, and how are they including or excluding post-colonial societies in contemporary, for example, Accra, or in post-contemporary Nairobi. I think it's very important to also be like very critical in the way we look at or think about sanitation in the context of pandemic, for example, like who has access in terms of class, or even infrastructure like healthcare places, clinics, or hospitals. Where are they located? For example, like if the majority of the people for example, in Eritrea live outside of the capital city, healthcare for 80% of the population is very limited. For example, in my own research, I see, how the majority of the people who live in Eritrea in the rural communities will have difficulty getting access to treatment, for example, in the context of pandemic. And it has both, if you look at the sanitation policies that were designed in the colonial times, or if you look at the infrastructure developments that were happening in the colonial times, still in the post-colonial context, also we need to kind of be more critical in our educational institutions. For example, in elementary school or high school, or even in university level, the education that we provide to our students. And I could see, how your work is very relevant, if just bringing it to Elon context, so that our students can understand like any misconceptions about African cities, like, where do the majority of the people live, how urban areas are at the center, and the model that you showed, the video is very, educational for, critical thinking from elementary all the way to the university level. So when I'm thinking about like the global neighborhoods that we have at Elon, the residential areas could benefit from your teaching and your research. So thank you.
I think that in the post colonial period too, we also look at it internationally. I mean, the post-colonial government came with the idea of providing healthcare, education for everybody. And then the Cold War era came, and that looked like socialism, something definitely that the United States was against, something that Britain was against. So President Reagan and Margaret Thatcher basically worked with the World Bank and the IMF to say that, well, African government, if you need any loan from us, you need any help from us, then you have to stop that. It's socialism. So that took away healthcare and education from a lot of people in Africa. So the impact is still being felt today as the government health is sort of like shrinking with all these structural adjustment pressures that is mounted on African countries by the US and Britain. And then I always like to use my own personal example to illustrate this, because in one of those occasions, I could have been dropped from the university because of some of these policies. If we, the ordinary people in the University of Ghana, had not gone on the streets to protest it, we occupied the castle, the seat of government, and we said we're not going to leave if the government did not reject it. But what it was trying to do, it was following the United States dictates by saying that they are going to increase school fees. That would have kicked 50% out of us from the university. So, so the post-colonial era came with broken promises that were made by the nationalist leaders who got independence for Africa, who said we're going to provide advantages for everybody. And then came in the Cold War and then structural adjustment that was taking all of it from that. So as Cooper argued, that this period, the optimism that came with independence from colonialism was beginning to wane, was beginning to shrink because of this context.
I see the time at 1:25, and I want to be mindful that I know people have to shift and go to classes. I continue sitting in this space, thinking about space in this space that you've created for us, and listen and learn further. But I hope that this is just the beginning of conversations. I hope that we all can go back and encourage our students to take your classes, to learn more from you, and that we can all find ways, whether virtually, in person, to have opportunities. Because I think that you intersect with so many people on campus, and this is a conversation that is so incredibly important. Thank you all so much for being here today, to listen and to learn, to create community in space. Hopefully we will be having more talks as the spring goes on in March and in April. But I also want to make sure that everyone is aware that African and African American Studies, in addition to the History and Memory Committee, as well as History and Geography, Poverty and Social Justice, primarily Sociology and Anthropology, Truett Center. I think I'm probably missing a few people from this list, but there are a bunch of us who are co-sponsoring a talk next Wednesday. This talk is open to the public. It's open to everyone. It's at 6 o'clock, I believe, 6 o'clock. is it 6 o'clock or 6:30? I think it's 6:30. It's 6:30, sorry about that. Raj Ghoshal sent out an email earlier ago. We'll probably send out another announcement, but it is, we are encouraging people to watch the film in Outrage, which looks at violence, anti-Black violence, particularly lynching throughout the US. And then we are asking people to come and engage with some dynamic panelists to talk about not only unpacking that film, but the legacy of anti-Black violence in Alamance County. In fact, the event is titled for Wyatt Outlaw, who was the first Black constable in Alamance County who was murdered. And there are Elon connections to that murder that we need to talk about and think about. And I think it all relates also to this discussion today about space and who has the right to occupy, or the assumption of who has the right to occupy space, who has the right to police certain space as well. And so I'm hopeful that that is going to be a very powerful discussion. It is a discussion that will bring up a lot of feelings. And so I do want to let people know that at the end of the discussion, we have persons who will be available to just help us process these feelings. Because as much as we have to talk about trauma, we also have to provide ways to heal from trauma as well. So once again, thank you all so much for coming. Dr. Waseem Kasim, thank you so much for this. We're going to have you back. I feel like there is at least a part 2, if not part 3, unfolding before us. Thank you all. Enjoy the sun while we have it.
Yeah.
Bye, everyone.